Good evening and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be reading to you from this book about the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is a very long book, so I'm not going to read to you the entire thing. I'm going to read to you the first chapter, which is an overview of the history of the Ottoman Empire. And then I'll just flip through the book with you and show you the pictures and talk about them. There we go. Let's dive right in and learn all about the Ottoman Empire. There we go. From nomads to sultans. I'll just let you look at the cool picture here while I read. The 20th century Turkish poet Nazim Hikmet once compared the shape of Anatolia to the head of a galloping horse charging westward out of the continent of Asia. The image is a fitting one considering the peninsula's long history of invasion and conquest by horse-mounted warriors. The earliest Turks, the ancestors of the Ottoman Turks, lived in the steppes or grasslands of Central Asia. This high, dry region stretches from north of Afghanistan and the Himalaya Mountains all the way to the northwestern part of China. Brief growing seasons, freezing winters, and scorching summers made agriculture extremely difficult. However, hardy breeds of cattle, sheep, and goats were able to survive in the treeless and wide open expanse of the steppes. Given little choice as to livelihood, the Turks became herders. Grazing exhausted the land, so once an area of the grasslands was eaten bare, the Turkish herders were forced to move their livestock. Over the years, a nomadic way of life evolved. The nomads continuously moved according to the needs of their animals, which in turn provided them with food and wool. Organization among the Turkish nomads was loose. They lived in separate tribes, with each tribe led by a respected male. Disunited, the Turks posed little threat to other peoples. United, they were a formidable force. Sometimes they came together under one powerful leader called a Khan, for the purpose of raiding or conquest. Riding small, sturdy horses and armed only with bows, Turkish horsemen could easily launch a rapid surprise attack against a foe and then just as quickly vanish. They used this tactic to raid areas of Europe and China. As they pressed into the lands bordering on the Middle East, they came into contact with Islam. This religion, founded by the Prophet Muhammad in the Arabian Peninsula in the 600s CE, spread throughout the Middle East in the 700s. Contact with Islam would have great significance for the Turks. The meeting ground for the Turks and Muslims, people who follow Islam, was Transoxiana, a region of Central Asia that today is located within the borders of Uzbekistan. The people of Transoxiana had become Muslims in the 700s to 800s. Islam not only became their religion but also shaped their culture. Mosques were built for worship services. Schools were set up to teach the religion, and government institutions were established to bring the Islamic legal tradition to all aspects of life. This way of life centered around the worship of one God, who was called Allah in Arabic, the language of Muhammad, was profoundly different from that of the nomadic Turks. Muslim missionaries to Transoxiana converted the Turkish tribespeople who moved into the region. Once most of the Turks of Central Asia had been converted to Islam, they were accepted as important allies of the caliphs, the rulers of Muslim domains in the Middle East. Turkish warriors became soldiers to the armies of the caliphs. When the caliphs were weak, Turkish tribes managed to gather more and more power. One such group was the Seljuks, who established the first great Turkish empire. The Seljuk Turks enter Anatolia. The Seljuk Turks rose to prominence in the 11th century in Transoxiana. Gradually, they became so strong that they were able to seize lands on their borders. They moved into northeastern Persia in the mid-1000s and soon conquered all of that region. Tugrul, the Seljuks' leader, took the title of Sultan, or holder of power. At this point, the formerly nomadic Seljuks began to adopt a settled life, which included the administration of a government. Because they had no tradition of collecting taxes, organizing large fighting forces, or carrying out laws, the Seljuks adopted the methods of the former Muslim rulers of the lands they had conquered. They used those borrowed traditions to rule an empire that soon stretched from Central Asia through what are now Iraq and Iran and included the eastern half of Anatolia. As their power grew, the Seljuks began to move into western Anatolia, where they came into contact with the peoples, armies, and institutions of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines, who were Eastern Orthodox Christians, had once controlled vast lands extending from the Caucasus Mountains in the east to the rim of northern Africa and as far west as Spain. By 1054, however, their empire had greatly shrunk in size. Byzantine lands south of Anatolia had been seized by Arab Muslim conquerors and absorbed into Islamic empires. Now the heartland of the Byzantine Empire was under pressure from the Seljuk Turks. In 1071, the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan engaged the Byzantine army at Manzikert in eastern Anatolia and defeated it. That victory opened Byzantine lands to Turkish settlement. With the Byzantine armies retreating in defeat and the empire in disarray, the Seljuks were free to take Syria and Palestine unopposed. This period of conquest marked the height of Seljuk power. In the late 11th century, divisions began to grow within the great Seljuk Empire. There were several reasons for this development. Following Turkish tribal traditions, Seljuk sultans divided their conquests among members of their families. Those family members were left free to rule their holdings and control their own armies. When a sultan died, it was common for a struggle to break out among his sons and nephews for control of the empire. This led to disunity. The traditional nomadic way of life of the Turkish tribes also contributed to the empire's problems. The independent nomad warriors who formed the core of the Seljuk armies and followed the Sultan in conquering new lands were reluctant to give him their undivided allegiance. When the conquests were over, the nomads returned home to tend to their own interests. By 1092, the great Seljuk Empire had begun to break up. The Seljuks who had moved into Anatolia formed a separate empire called Seljuk Rum, for Roman, as the Arabs called the Byzantine Empire. 4 years later, in 1096, the Seljuks of Rome encountered the soldiers of the First Crusade, Europeans who invaded the Middle East in order to wrest control of the Holy Land from the Muslims. A long period of warfare and chaos followed. The first wave of crusaders defeated the Seljuks of Rome in battle. Sanjar, the last great Seljuk sultan, tried unsuccessfully to restore the Seljuks' influence and territories. With his death in 1157, the period of great Seljuk rule came to an end, though sultans would continue to rule in Seljuk Rum for another 100 years. The early Ottomans, 1281 to 1446. As the power of the Seljuk Turks began to decline, another nomadic Turkish people came into prominence in western Anatolia. These were the Ottoman Turks, whose name may have derived from their first leader, Osman I, who ruled from 1281 to 1326. The Ottomans settled in northwestern Anatolia early in the 1200s as vassals or underlords of the Seljuks of Rum. At this time, the Seljuks of Rum were being pressured by a foreign invader. The Mongols, another nomadic people from Central Asia, were moving west in search of fresh pasture lands. Mongol tribes attacked Persia and established an empire there, then moved into Russia. By the 1200s, the Mongols had swept into central Anatolia and destroyed Seljuk Rum lands. They never established permanent settlements, however, and instead were content to take tribute from the people whose lands they invaded. During the 1300s, various Ottoman sultans expanded their control over Seljuk Mongol areas in Anatolia. Osman I was a skilled soldier and leader who brought many nomad groups under his banner to wage successful wars on other principalities in Anatolia, making treaties when it suited him and playing one group against another. He gained more and more power and influence. Osman was aided in his conquests by Ghazis, Muslim warriors of the faith from the border areas of Anatolia who volunteered to take part in jihads, or holy wars. In its purest, most basic sense, jihad means the internal spiritual struggle to become a better Muslim. It also has another meaning, the duty of a Muslim to advance Islam among non-believers and to defend the faith against its enemies. During Osman's rule, the Ghazis waged war against the Byzantine Christian lands around them. In 1302, Osman defeated the Byzantines at Nicaea, modern-day Iznik, and established an Ottoman principality. Thus, Osman and his Ghazi followers were the founders of the Ottoman state. The Ottomans set up villages on the conquered Byzantine and Seljuk Rome lands in Anatolia. They began to impose taxes for the support of their young state. They also were ever eager to acquire new territories. That goal brought them into Europe. In 1352, Ottoman forces under the Sultan or Han crossed the Bosporus, one of the narrow straits that separates the continents of Europe and Asia, and established a presence on European soil. In 1354, they settled at Gallipoli, a peninsula that juts into the Aegean Sea. In 1361, they seized the city of Adrianople in Thrace, renaming it Edirne, I believe. This city became the Ottoman center of power. Soon all of the former Byzantine lands around the city of Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul, were under their control. Then they advanced northwest into the Balkan Peninsula. The peoples of the Balkans were separated from one another by steep mountain ranges and deep valleys. Each region was ruled by its own king or prince. These rulers frequently battled one another, and they often sided with the Ottomans in war if the result suited their goals. Rather than attempting to conquer this divided region, the Ottomans decided on another tactic. When they defeated a Balkan king, they offered to allow him to keep his titles and lands in return for allegiance and support in time of war. One group that accepted this arrangement was the Serbs, who came under Ottoman rule in 1386. A few years later, however, the Serbs asserted their independence in a series of skirmishes and battles against the Ottomans. In 1389, the Ottoman Sultan Murat I faced the rebellious Serbs under their leader, Prince Lazar, and his Bosnian and Bulgarian allies. The two armies gathered at Kosovo Field, the Field of Blackbirds, on June 15th. Just before the battle, Murat was assassinated by a Serb posing as a deserter. Murat's son, Bayezid, took command, and in the battle that unfolded, led the Ottoman forces in a total defeat of the Serbs. The Ottomans captured Lazar and put him to death. Soon Serbian opposition to Ottoman control was broken. Sultan Bayezid I, nicknamed the Thunderbolt, continued the Turkish conquests in Europe and subdued Bulgaria. By 1400, the Ottoman Turks held lands that stretched from the Black to the Aegean Sea. The Classical Age, 1447 to 1566. The city of Constantinople, all that was left of the once mighty Byzantine Empire, remained out of Ottoman reach. Whoever conquered it, and many had tried, would gain the prestige of controlling the most important city in the world, the point where Europe and Asia meet, a port city once famed for its riches and trade and luxury items, and a seat of ancient imperial power. When Mehmet II, called the Conqueror, became Sultan in 1451, he made it his goal to take Constantinople. Mehmet planned well. The Ottoman fleet was assembled and dropped anchor near the city walls. Continuing an Ottoman tradition known as devshirme, or gathered, Mehmet had drafted young Christian boys from the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and trained them into a crack military corps called the Janissaries. The Sultan added the Janissaries to his army of nearly 160,000. When the Byzantines sought help from the Pope and European princes, the Ottoman grip around Constantinople gradually tightened. In 1453, Mehmed began a 54-day siege of Constantinople. He used every means available to break through the ancient walls of the well-fortified city. The Sultan commissioned a German engineer named Urban to create a huge cannon capable of smashing holes through the walls. 30 pairs of oxen were used to haul the 27-foot-long cannon overland to within range of Constantinople. Once in position, it joined with other cannons in a bombardment that began on April 6. As the walls were damaged, the defenders quickly repaired them. Earlier, in anticipation of an Ottoman invasion by sea, the Byzantines had placed a huge chain across the entrance to the Golden Horn, the harbor of Constantinople. Mehmed countered by building a road on which ships were maneuvered by means of tracks over a hill to the edge of the Golden Horn. There, to the amazement of the Byzantines, the ships were lowered into the harbor. On May 28th, outgunned, outnumbered, and running desperately short on food, the remaining 8,000 defenders of Constantinople gathered at Hagia Sophia, the great church of the Byzantine Empire, for a final prayer. Emperor Constantine XI joined the throng, said his prayers, and as darkness enveloped the city, left the church to inspect the battered walls. On May 29th, 1453, as the Ottomans finally broke through the walls of the city, Constantine himself forged forward to join in the hand-to-hand battle. He and the other defenders of Constantinople went to their deaths as the Ottoman soldiers overwhelmed them. Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople brought the Byzantine Empire to a close. The Turks turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque, a Muslim house of worship. The city's other churches, as well as its palaces and public buildings, were protected and preserved for the Sultan's use. Over the next 20 years, Mehmed seized the Dardanelles, a thin waterway between Asia and Europe, and Ottoman ships sailed through the strait to the vast Mediterranean. The merchant empire of Venice dominated the Mediterranean's coasts and trade. From 1463 to 1479, the Ottomans battled the Venetians on land and sea, while Mehmed seized their goods and imprisoned their merchants. Ottoman Turkish armies also advanced into the Balkans and brought Bosnia into the Sultan's empire. Mehmed demanded that all territories surrounding the Black Sea recognize Ottoman control. The Ottomans now ruled over two lands, Europe and Asia. Mehmed could truly call himself sovereign of the two lands and the two seas. Mehmed the Conqueror regarded himself as the direct successor to the Byzantine empires. Giving Constantinople a new name, Istanbul, he made it the capital of the empire. Mehmed rebuilt the city with mosques and Islamic religious schools called madrasas. The Sultan also had a vast palace called Topkapi built for himself and his court. And since a city without people is nothing, he encouraged Muslims, Christians, and Jews to settle in Istanbul. Mehmed was keenly aware of the fact that he now ruled over an empire that was more than 50% Christian, including the peoples of former Byzantine lands and the Balkans, and took steps to gain their allegiance. With this in mind, he proclaimed himself the protector of the Christian church and in the Ottoman Empire. Protector of the Christian church in the Ottoman Empire. Let's take a second to look at this map, because we're going to talk about this next. So, of course, all the green will be the Ottoman Empire. You can see the border right here on Vienna. All up here around Russia, surrounding the entire Black Sea. So they have Bosnia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Thrace, Anatolia, up to the Caucasus Mountains. All the way down here through the Syrian desert, they have Beirut, Damascus, Jerusalem, Medina and Mecca, Cairo for here in Egypt, and then all across the northern African coast. A massive, massive empire with all different kinds of peoples in it. Let's continue. The decline of the Ottoman Empire, 1567 to 1789. The most outstanding leaders of the Ottoman Empire were the warrior sultans, including Mehmed II and two rulers of the early 1500s, Selim I and his son Suleiman I. They were able to build a huge empire through a combination of military conquests and capable rule. The reign of the most skilled of them, Suleiman I, marked the high point of Ottoman greatness. The sultans who came after Suleiman were less able rulers. Some were incompetent or wasted the empire's resources satisfying their own lavish habits. Some gave up much of their authority to their chief advisor, the Grand Vizier. This arrangement worked well if the Grand Vizier was honest and capable. If he was not, the empire suffered. Sultans were often involved in bloody struggles with family members to retain their power or dictate the succession. At first, any of the sons of the Sultan could succeed to the throne. This was a tradition that dated back to the early Turkish and Mongol Khans. Regardless of his methods, the son who gained power was usually looked upon as the legitimate ruler. There were problems with this system, however. Whenever a sultan died or was about to die, contests for power broke out among his sons. Sometimes these contests became full-fledged wars in which brothers killed brothers or fathers had their sons killed or imprisoned. The office of the Ottoman Sultan was ultimately weakened as a result of these practices. Other problems began to eat away at Ottoman power. One of these was linked to the Janissaries, the Sultan's special fighting force. The Janissaries' role was to protect the life of the Sultan, an assignment that made them very powerful indeed. They used their unique position to gain influence in the government. By the 1500s, the Janissaries had become so powerful that they were often able to overthrow a weak sultan or grand vizier and replace them with one of their favorites. When their influence was threatened, they rose up in revolt. Other challenges came from forces outside the empire. The Europeans matched the Ottomans' military presence whenever and wherever they could. In the 1600s, Austrian and Polish forces drove the Ottomans from lands south of the Danube River. In the 1700s, Russia expelled them from the Crimea, the European peninsula that extends into the Black Sea. There were economic challenges as well. At first, the Ottomans encouraged trade with other nations as a way of building alliances and keeping would-be rivals such as the Venetians at peace. They welcomed English, French, and Dutch merchants and granted capitulations, agreements giving the foreigners the right to carry on trade within the empire. In return, the empire placed a customs tax on the trade. For a time, this arrangement benefited all parties. A steady supply of manufactured goods flowed into the empire, and the treasury filled with money from the customs taxes. The Europeans gained a large market for their ever-growing range of goods. However, when the Industrial Revolution began in Europe in the late 1700s, the nations of Western Europe began to fiercely compete with one another for control over markets for their new factory-produced goods. They also began to take advantage of their trade agreements with the Ottomans. By the 1800s, inexpensive European goods were flooding into the eastern Mediterranean and pushing out native manufacturers. Native products and producers were harmed as the empire became more and more dependent upon foreign imports. Attitudes towards technological advances and scientific inquiry also harmed the Ottoman Empire. At various times, fanatical religious thinkers opposed innovations of all kinds, including the teaching of the sciences, claiming that inquiry was not in keeping with Islamic tradition. This began to change in the 1800s when the Ottomans started to adopt European technology and ways of doing things. As the empire grew more efficient, it became evident to reformers that much work remained to be done. But the Ottoman Empire could not match Europe's industrial might, nor compete with it militarily. All the Ottomans could do was try to improve on all fronts in a piecemeal fashion. That proved to be an impossible task. The sick man of Europe. During the 1800s, non-Muslim groups throughout the Ottoman Empire were stirred by feelings of nationalism. They began to rediscover the legends and myths of their peoples and to write poems and books about the greatness of their pre-Ottoman past. Supported by the leaders of European nations, nationalist leaders began to demand separation from Ottoman rule. The Balkans posed a special problem for the Ottomans. This region of southeastern Europe had long attracted the attention of Russia, the empire's chief rival to the north. Since the Ottoman conquest of the Byzantines in 1453, Russia had regarded itself as the leader of the Eastern Orthodox Church and big brother to Orthodox Christians in southeastern Europe. When Christian separatist leaders in the Balkans began demanding independence from Ottoman Islamic rule, the Russians believed it was their duty to aid them and help them drive out the Muslims. Throughout the 1800s, several of the Balkan states, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Montenegro, fought for their freedom and won it. Russia also had economic reasons for challenging the Ottomans. For years, Russia's merchant fleet had sought control of the warm waters around the Black Sea, as well as the Straits of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. In the 1700s and 1800s, the Ottomans fought several wars to try to stop Russia's expansion into these territories. In the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, the Ottomans received help from France and Great Britain and held back the Russian advance. In another war with Russia from 1877 to 1878, the empire suffered a terrible defeat, the loss of the northern and eastern shores of the Black Sea. At home, Ottoman sultans went into debt to maintain the army and defend the empire. In the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire's deteriorating situation earned it the pathetic nickname of the sick man of Europe. Even in decline, the Ottoman Empire remained a functioning state whose people looked to it for leadership, justice, and services. The bureaucracy continued to carry out the day-to-day administration of the vast empire as young intellectuals tried to change the government from within. In 1895, they started a movement, the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, to reform the government and make the empire democratic. Their goals included a written constitution and the establishment of an elected parliament. The leaders of the CUP eventually became known as the Young Turks. Their intended reforms promised a westernized military, an end to capitulations, and a new way of life for Turks similar to that of Western Europeans. By the early 1900s, the Young Turks had become the most important force within the Ottoman government. However, the future they envisioned never came about. World War I interrupted their plans and devastated the empire. The end of the Ottoman Empire. World War I was a turning point in the history of Europe and Turkey. The war broke out in August 1914 in Sarajevo, Bosnia. Great Britain, France, and Russia joined together as the Allies to fight Germany and Austria-Hungary, which formed the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire reluctantly joined the Central Powers. It hoped to regain lost territory and protect itself from Russia, its longtime enemy. The decision to take part in the war had fatal consequences for the Turkish people. In 1915, Turkish troops were fighting Russian forces in eastern Anatolia, a region historically inhabited by Armenians. The Armenians, who were Christian, had their own distinct ancient culture and wanted their own nation. Armenian factions in and around the city of Van helped the Russian forces, viewing them as liberators from Ottoman rule. The Ottoman leaders, fearing a full-scale revolt by the Armenians and a breakdown of civil authority, ordered deportations. During the spring of 1915, about 2 million Armenians were forced to leave their homes in eastern Anatolia. The scene was grim. Eastern Anatolia was a devastated and disease-ridden war zone through which defeated Ottoman troops were retreating. Many of the Armenians trekking out of the area were attacked and killed by Turks and Kurds, seeking revenge for Armenian atrocities. The survivors, mainly women and children, were marched to northern Syria. Altogether, about 1 million Armenians died during 1915. these events continue to haunt Armenian-Turkish relations. Ottoman rule was under attack in the Middle East as well. The British drove the Ottoman forces out of Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. In 1916, they helped the Arabs stage a revolt against Ottoman rule in Arabia and Syria. By 1918, the Turkish troops were exhausted. About 325,000 Ottoman soldiers had been killed in the fighting, and more than 2 million civilians throughout the empire had died. Millions of people were displaced. Muslims in the Balkans, the Crimea, and the Caucasus region were driven from their homes into Anatolia. With the government defeated and countless refugees pouring in, Turkey faced a desperate situation. The government leaders fled into exile, and the Sultan asked for peace. Greek, British, and French troops occupied Anatolia immediately after the war. Turkey's situation seemed hopeless as the victorious allies prepared to carve it up. The terms of the Treaty of Sèvres, imposed upon the Ottoman Sultan by the Allies in 1920, gave Greece western Anatolia and the Armenians their own country in eastern Anatolia. Arabs and Kurds were also promised their own territories. The Turks were to receive only a small area in central and northern Anatolia. In addition, Turkey was stripped of its former provinces of Mesopotamia, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. Peace seemed more terrible than defeat as the Turks faced the loss of the empire and their centuries-old homeland. Then, in 1919, one man made a decision that would have dramatic results for Turkey and its people. His name was Mustafa Kemal. Under his leadership, Turkey was reborn as a modern nation. A new nation is born. Between 1919 and 1922, Mustafa Kemal, a former Ottoman army officer, led Turkish nationalist forces against the occupying army of Greece. Kemal had no organized army, few arms, and no money, yet he set up his headquarters in Ankara and put together an army. The campaign he waged is known to Turks as the War for Independence. In 1922, Kemal abolished the office of the Sultan and dissolved the Ottoman Empire. Soon thereafter, a new peace treaty, the Treaty of Lausanne, was negotiated with the Allies. The treaty recognized the sovereignty and independence of Turkey and established its present-day borders. Its significance was great. Turkey was the only defeated nation in World War I to negotiate with the victors as an equal and influence the war's outcome. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed and Mustafa Kemal was named its president. When the new president ordered all Turks to adopt Western-style last names in place of their traditional Ottoman names, the Turkish Grand National Assembly chose the name for him, Ataturk. The name means Father Turk. Alright. So in a nutshell, that was the history of the Ottoman Empire. So let's flip through this book and show you some pictures. So here is Suleiman I, or Suleiman the Magnificent, surrounded by his Janissaries. Let's see, this is the Battle of Mohacs in Hungary. I'm sure I said that wrong. Let's see, so here we see Istanbul and this huge mosque, the Süleymaniye, I believe, which was built in his honor. It's still there today, as you can tell by the photograph. Caravansaries were kind of like hostels for caravans. And it was like a luxury place to stay when caravan traders were traveling through the empire. Here is a picture of the Queen's Harem, a special place in her Topkapi Palace, in her residence there. So here we see the Queen surrounded by her handmaidens, I assume, while there's musicians and dancers performing. You can see the guard over here protecting the women. And yeah, regal, beautiful harem for the Queen and her ladies. Look at this guy. He's got a big old, I guess it's a lute, and it's like bigger than him. heavy. What else do we have? Let's see. The Grand Bazaar of Istanbul. The big arched ceiling. You can see all the different stalls selling pots, pottery, carpets, everything you can need. And here we see a lady with her slave, it says, at the hammam, or the Turkish bath. And she's got a beautiful outfit on, and they have these big old platform shoes, which is so they can walk in the streets and not get mud on their shoes. And look at this huge pipe she has. That's wild. Oh, look at this guy. He's like, oh, but he's actually praying. He looks like he got a little shock while he was praying, but he's in the zone, I suppose. Look at this miniature painting. There we go. It's really cool because once you look close enough, you can see that it's the Kaaba in Mecca. A little, like, aerial view of the Kaaba. I think that's really neat. And here's another painting. This is apparently, this is apparently a Ramadan celebration. Playing some music and parading around on their horses. Maybe donkeys based on those ears. I'm not sure. Here's a really beautiful painting of some men praying in the mosque. And these are the dervishes, or the Mevlevi, doing their whirling dance as they enter a meditative prayer state. Here's the Sultan. Does it say which one? It doesn't, but he's surrounded by the Janissaries, which we heard in the beginning were Christian boys that were taken from their home and converted to Islam, and they became, like, I want to say almost like samurai in a way, like this elite fighting force for the Sultan. Here's this guy, and I can't remember because I've already done Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina in my series, and this painting was in one of the books, but I can't remember which one it was, but it said his name and everything. He was one of the leaders of the Janissaries with a magnificent turban. Here is a Hebrew scroll, because this chapter is about how the Ottomans were very welcome toward Jewish people moving into their territory, and during the, I just forgot the Spanish Inquisition, Jews were welcomed to flee to the Ottoman Empire. I like this painting too because it looks like he's like hugging his bear friend, but he's actually a bear wrestler out in the streets of Istanbul. This guy doesn't look too amused by it. I think that would be an interesting sight to see. Look at the little bear cub. And we have some women out with their children, out shopping, looking for maybe spices or food. Oh, it says they're buying sweets for their kids. So, Ottoman paintings were so interesting. Look at all of this movement happening. There's so much going on. We can see a wrestling match down here with people watching. People climbing the trees to get a better view. They're like, get down. This guy's reading. He doesn't care. This guy looks like he's surrounded by all his like slaves and servants fanning him or keeping him safe. What's he doing? I'm not sure. Maybe he's taking bets there around a cauldron. Like, there's so much happening in all of these little busy paintings. It's so neat to just stare at it and find something different with everybody. Here's another kind of cool version, but this is at the madrasa. So these boys are studying Islam from their teacher, reading their books. And this chapter is about how Ottoman influence still exists today in Turkey. So of course here's a picture of the Grand Bazaar that we saw the painting of in modern day. So we see some, neon signs, electricity, refrigerators for all the wares, but still the same bazaar. A really cool carpet. I read this chapter and it's really interesting how they talk about the carpets and how all the designs and how they're woven and what colors they used indicate where it was made and who made it. That's really cool. And there's a lady making carpet on a loom. This is the tugra. It's like the signature of the Sultan, like a fancy calligraphy signature. And this was for Suleiman the Magnificent. This is how he wrote his name. A ceramic plate from Iznik, which was their like big craft, their big artisanal ware they sold. And here's a painting of Mehmet II, painted, oh, he was a court painter, I'm sorry, Gentil Bellini was called to Istanbul as a court painter in 1479. And here's a shadow puppet for shadow theater, which was a big thing back then in Turkey. And to close the video, let's read a timeline of the Ottoman Empire. My cat's eating his dry food in the background. Sorry if you can hear that, but let's see. In 1302, Osman I defeats the Byzantines at Nicaea and establishes the Ottoman state. In 1326, the Ottoman Turks captured Bursa, south of Constantinople. In 1361, the Ottoman Turks seized Adrianople in Thrace and rename it Edirne. In 1376, the Devshirme, the practice of taking young Christian boys into the Sultan's army, begins. In 1389, the Ottomans defeat the Serbs and their allies at Kosovo Field. In 1422, the first Ottoman siege of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 1430, Sultan Murat II conquers northern Greece. 1451, Mehmet II becomes the Ottoman Sultan. And in 1453, Constantinople falls to the forces of Mehmet II and ends the Byzantine Empire. From 1520 to 1566 was the rule of Suleiman I, or Suleiman the Magnificent, and was the peak of Ottoman power. In 1526, the Ottoman troops conquered Hungary. In 1529, Vienna was besieged by the Ottoman armies, but they held out. In 1550, construction began on the Suleymaniye. In 1571, the Ottoman navy defeats the Venetians at the Battle of Lepanto. In 1683, the Ottoman siege of Vienna fails. In 1691 to 1695, the Ottoman Empire was at war with Poland, Austria, Russia, and Venice. In 1699, the Ottomans signed the Treaty of Karlowitz with the European powers. They give up lands in Europe. From 1703 to 1730 was the Tulip Period, which was called that because the Sultan of the time was obsessed with tulips. But it's also kind of like a name for the little mini Renaissance they had. This was the introduction of the first printing press in Istanbul and glorification of the arts. In 1821, Greece revolted against Ottoman rule. 1853 to 1856 was the Crimean War. From 1861 to 1876, the Balkans rose up against Ottoman rule. In 1876, the first Ottoman constitution was allowed by the Sultan. In 1877, Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. In 1878 was the Treaty of Berlin. And the Ottoman Empire loses lands in the Balkans and northeastern Anatolia. In 1909, the Young Turks forced the Sultan to accept constitutional reforms. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered World War I on the side of the Central Powers. And then in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was defeated in World War I. In 1919, Mustafa Kemal organizes resistance to Allied occupation of defeated Turkey. In 1922, the office of Sultan was abolished. And in 1923, the Republic of Turkey was born. So that's it for tonight. Here we go. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope you have a very good